Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about what has been described by some as the missing piece in the jigsaw when it comes to the UK's plans to digitalise its borders and trade. This is the Electronic Trade Documents Act. Now, this piece of legislation received Royal Assent in the summer and is due to come into effect later this month. Digital Economy and Technology Minister Paul Scully has even said it could save businesses over £1.1 billion over the next decade, and it could also help traders to reduce their carbon footprint. Indeed, it's still a live talking point in Westminster, with Lord Holmes next week answering oral questions in Parliament about both the economic and environmental impacts of this significant piece of legislation. Today, we'll be talking about what it is, why it's so important, and what it means for you, UK businesses. My name is William Barnes-Gray. I'm the Executive Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host for today. To begin with, though, on the next slide, it is my delight to start introducing our excellent panel of speakers. We have 5 panelists today, or 6 if you include that fellow at the top of the slide. First of all, I'm delighted to welcome a stalwart of the webinar programme in Kevin Shakespeare. Hi, Kevin. How are you today?
I'm good, Will, and good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all well. Thank you.
Great stuff. Kevin, as many of you will know, is the Institute's Director of Strategic Projects and International Development, and is the mastermind behind several of the Institute's educational programmes, both in the UK and overseas. Also from the Institute, I'm delighted to welcome Ilona Kofka, a digital trade and customs specialist who, with Kevin, has been leading the Institute's work when it comes to unpacking and disseminating the opportunities that trade digitalisation will create for UK businesses. On the next slide, we're also delighted to be joined by 3 excellent experts and speakers from outside the Institute. Dipesh Patel is the Editorial Director at Trade Finance Global and the host of that organisation's Trade Finance Talks podcast and TV channel. Dipesh has been following this legislation from the perspective of the trade finance sector for quite a while now, so we're delighted he's been able to join our panel today. Next up, Sylvia Novak returns to our webinar programme and is indeed a member of the Institute. Sylvia is the Senior Customs and Foreign Trade Compliance Officer at Bros Group and is extremely knowledgeable on all things customs and digital trade. And last, but certainly not least, I'm delighted to welcome Ramin Takin, the co-founder of Exabler, a cloud-based software program that automates trade documentation. We're delighted Ramin is joining us to provide the perspective of the tech industry on the impact of this legislation. However, on the next slide, as is often my way, I'll begin today's webinar with a poll to find out a little bit more about you, our audience. So this one is asking, does your business use any of the following commonly used trade documents? You can select all that apply, and the options are bill of exchange, bill of lading, letters of credit, warehouse receipt, and if you do say other, please do say in the chat what that might mean. While you are answering that poll, as ever, some housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window, which is usually to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions today, though please note we cannot guarantee we will get to every question in the allocated time. As such, I will be prioritising questions that have relevance to the wider audience, and I won't be going into company or sector-specific queries as such. And please note that if your questions are short and clear, I am more likely to be able to read them, so please don't type in War and Peace. Finally, you will be receiving a recording of the webinar with a copy of the slides in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. So I will shortly close that poll. Thank you everyone for answering. And here are the results. So 82% of you say you've used bill of lading, 16% bills of exchange, 34% of you, just over a third, letters of credit, quite a lot, 49% warehouse receipts. And of the people saying other, we're hearing commercial invoices, CMR and phytosanitary certificates, a few people saying health certificates, certificates of origin, and a few others as well. So thank you everyone for answering that poll. And Kevin, just out of interest, I mean, this is a webinar about trade documents. So to what extent does that poll kind of inform what you're kind of thinking and hopes are for this webinar today?
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I think there's good level and split there. I think it's great we've got a really high participation today and strong audience, which reflects lots of different types of organisations, the traders, the importers, the exporters, government departments, the banks, fintechs, the shipping industry, logistics service providers. So I think it's reflective of that, and it's also reflective of how dynamic trade is as well, and lots of different trade opportunities.
Absolutely, and it really is a very interesting spread of people on the call today, as Kevin says. So thank you everyone for responding to that poll. As ever, really interesting for us to see kind of how you're responding to those sorts of things. But on the next slide, without any further ado, I think let's get on with it. So Kevin is going to give a short presentation to set the scene before we get into the panel discussion later on. Over to you, Kevin.
Brilliant, thank you. And can I also thank the various guests and speakers we have today, and we've got a great lineup. So what we're going to cover today is really explain the Electronic Trade Documents Act, what happens once the legislation enters into force, what businesses can do now to start preparing and get ready, but also the wider context of the opportunity we have now on digital trade, and looking at some potential challenges in industry adoption, but how these can be overcome. So again, it's quite interesting today, and we need to consider it in the context of global trade, regional trade, and our role in the international trade supply chain. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the history and the background to the Act, and I don't think we should underestimate how significant this Act is. After Singapore and the UAE, the UK is very much the third country to pass legislation. So in April 2021, the Law Commission published a consultation paper. Proposals were refined, and in March 2022, the report and draft bill were released. The bill was introduced into the House of Lords in October 2022, and the legal legislative procedure concluded in July this year, when the draft legislation received Royal Assent. And it's now upon us, the Act is upon us, and to take effect in September 2023. So a lot of fabulous work has taken place from a lot of people in getting to the stage, and we shouldn't underestimate the great people and the great team that have been involved in that. If we have a next slide, please. So what does the Act change? And it's important to reflect on this, is because as we've worked in international trade, and irrespective of your role in trade, we've all grown up with this concept of paper documentation, and the legislation really has gone back to the 1800s, like the Bills of Exchange Act, for example, and really only paper documents have been used to transfer ownership of goods. And we need to reflect, if we go back, as to why the 1800s, is that the likes of bills of lading and bills of exchange were the way that we changed money. It's the way we traded and other nations traded globally. We now have the opportunity to take the step forward. So the new law permits electronic trade documents to be treated in the same way as paper documents. It also enables the conversion of paper trade into digital copies. But just a reflection on ownership of the goods. Ownership of the goods is an important aspect of every single international trade transaction, whether we're selling from Great Britain to France, to the United States, to Canada, to Africa, to Asia, and so on. Transfer of ownership of those goods has to take place somewhere in the trade journey. So hence this Act is so important. If we have a next slide, please. So what does the Act effectively change? The electronic trade documents can be used in the same way as a paper version. So the information in the electronic form must be the same as it was contained in the paper version. It must be identifiable and distinguishable. It must be a reliable system. There must be document integrity, and only one person can exercise control of a document at any one time. If we have the next slide, please. So let's consider the benefits and really reflect on the benefits. And there are numerous benefits that maybe are not apparent at first glance here. It clearly will increase more efficiency and bring cost savings for the shipping industry. You now have the opportunity to have electronic bills, digital bills, as opposed to paper bills. It saves paper, and clearly that's better for the environment as well. It lowers carbon emission, but not just the actual paper document per se, or the set of free bills of lading. It also speeds up how we trade as well. So hopefully less goods lying at the port whilst the bill of lading, the paper bill of lading, has to be presented to take possession of the goods. So we must think of it in the wider context of reducing the cost to trade and reducing the time to trade as well, which also has a big impact in terms of carbon footprint. It improves security of trade as well. So when we think of the risks of paper documents in terms of anti-money laundering, trade finance, fraud, digital documents reduces that. And it provides a big boost to trade finance as well. So, for example, trade finance under Basel regulation. Can we make this today when trade finance gets the recognition it deserves within the trade transaction? Finance within the trade transaction, likes of export loans, is really, really significant. And we can hopefully get to the stage where SME businesses as well will benefit from greater access to trade finance and finance within the trade transaction. And clearly it's more regulatory compliance as well. But I just want to end this slide by also saying that it is about bills of lading, it is about bills of exchange, letters of credit, but also this gives a boost to the wider context of digital trade as well. If we think of the opportunity to have digital trade in its widest format, this is another key implementer of digital trade. So things like e-phyto certificates, e-export health certificates are very much programs taking place globally at the moment. So this is not just about deep sea shipping, bills of lading, trade finance. This is far wider in terms of the opportunity to facilitate trade as well. If we have a next slide, please. So there are challenges to implementation, and like anything new, we have to work through those, and there will be issues potentially that have to be overcome around data privacy, and also reliable systems. So it's very important that a business and the different actors in the international trade journey are aware that if they use technology companies, those technology companies are reliable. So reliable systems, a reliable register, are absolutely fundamental in that regard to provide the assurance that the businesses need and the industry needs as well. Training and education will be essential to industry adoption as well. So really supporting, explaining how things operate. And then finally, having standards behind it as well. So clearly, key standards, the ICC WTO Digital Standards Initiative, the DSI, is really, really important in this regard. So again, everyone has confidence that those standards exist and everyone is working towards standards and a common goal. So that's the sort of brief overview. I'll hand back to Will, and thank you again for the speakers today.
Terrific. Thank you, Kevin. Really, I think the point you made about the amount of work which has gone into this legislation, it seems to have been something years in the making. So I think that's a really important point. And yeah, some really interesting points about the benefits as well. The climate aspect to it, I think, can be overlooked sometimes. It's not just the paper, but the point you made about port dwell times being reduced by the speeding up of trade through this legislation, I think, is really important as well. So thank you for setting the scene there. I'm just going to, on the next slide, I think we've got a poll, which I shall launch. And this one is asking you, our audience, what impact you think the legislation will have on your business. It's a scale, so options ranging from very positive impact to very negative impact, with a neutral in between. So as people are answering that poll, Kevin, we always get great questions in from the audience, and we've already had a few people asking about the kind of centrality of bills of lading within the legislation. So Martin asks, I know the bill of lading is important in this act, but can you explain to me how a bill of lading should be treated in line with the payment terms for my exports globally?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. It's a good question. I think sometimes, and I know when the Institute, we have our studies, we really focus in some respects on the role of the bill of lading and its uniqueness in international trade. Yes, it's a transport document, it's a contract of carriage, a receipt for the goods, but also it's that negotiability. But we need to think about that in the payment terms, whether you're selling on open account terms, part payment, cash in advance, documentary bank collection, documentary letter of credit. The bill of lading, when used, is highly significant, and businesses need to be sure when they release the bill of lading it's in line with the payment terms. So the bill of lading is a really good form of control. Clearly, if you have a original negotiable bill of lading, it is that possession, that document of title. So we encourage all businesses to really sort of be clear on the role of the bill of lading in international trade, because I feel with all the changes we've had, the role of the bill of lading in certain sectors for importers and exporters, the significance, especially for deep sea, wider routes, is maybe not as appreciated as much as it was 10 years ago. So this gives another opportunity to really focus on that role of the bill of lading. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Hope that's helpful. Martin, we'll keep the poll running for a few more seconds. We've had another question come through from Lindsay, who says, the Electronic Trade Documents Act is very good news. Is there anything else going on to support digital trade and to reduce manual processes?
Yeah, again, a great question. There's a lot going on in the UK, globally, and even in the European Union as well, with the announcements on the EU customs reform as well. So in the UK, we obviously had the announcement of the border target operating model just over a week ago, or last week. And that does refer to elements such as the single trade window, the ecosystem of trust works as well. So there's a lot taking place, the Institute heavily involved with UNCFACT in some of their projects as well. So a lot taking place on digital trade, because we have the opportunity again to use digital trade as a force for good in the world, to also help the SMEs, the developing nations as well, take a step up. So a lot is going on, and again, I think later on we'll give you a bit of a flavour of that in terms of some of the activity going on. But the answer is yes, and we want to support businesses understand how this all links together, how the Electronic Trade Documents Bill links to the likes of the single trade window, the ecosystem of trust, the eFITO, and various other initiatives taking place globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. A great question, Lindsay. And yeah, we'll have to pick up on that later. Digital trade as a force for good. A really interesting point. So hopefully that will come up in the Q&A later on. But conscious of time, so let's see the results of the poll. Unsurprisingly, really, the majority of you think it's either quite positive or very positive. It's still at an earlier stage in its implementation, so 46% quite positive, next up 29% very positive, and the quarter view is still kind of waiting to see a little bit, I suspect. No one's saying negative at all, so that seems pretty positive, Kevin. It's pretty universal that people are generally pretty positive about it.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is positive, and I think what we've now all got to do is really try to explain specifically how it's positive and how we can implement the benefits of the Act and other digital trade initiatives.
Great stuff. Well, thank you everyone for responding to that poll. And I think at the next slide, it is time for me to bring on the rest of our panel. And what a panel we've got. So really delighted to be back. Joining Kevin, we have Dipesh Patel from Trade Finance Global, Sylvia Novak from Bros Group, Ramin Takin from Exabler, and Ilona Kovka from the Institute. So Dipesh, to begin with yourself, to begin this conversation, as someone who's been following the enactment of this bill from a trade finance perspective, what do you see as the main opportunities that the legislation will lead to, firstly for the UK trade in general, and secondly for the trade finance sector?
Thank you very much, Will, and also thanks to the Institute of Export and International Trade for the kind invitation to take part in the webinar. I actually just want to make a comment on the poll actually, and the fact that 25% of respondents had a kind of neutral, doesn't really matter response to what their thoughts on the Electronic Trade Documents Act is, and I guess I bring reference to the permissive nature of the bill. So trade finance, a document, both paper-based and electronics, can kind of keep going as normal. It's up to us as participants, users, practitioners in the industry to make use of the bill to actually see the impact. So you know, commendations to IOE and IT for driving this initiative. Obviously, Kevin, you've given a really good comprehensive overview of some of the rationale, context, and the benefits, and I think your point on a force for good in the world is really important, especially when it comes to SME access, particularly in emerging and developing markets. I mean, we saw the report yesterday from Asian Development Bank. The trade finance gap has grown from 1.7 to 2.5 trillion US dollars for 2022, which is significant. So I've been following the enactment of this bill for around 12 months, and I guess I'm keen to give a bit of a trade finance angle. Now that the bill's been passed in the UK, where we are closer to removing some of the legal barriers which have largely been blamed / responsible for holding back many of those possible benefits that digital trade brings. I guess before going into the benefits, Will, I think it's important to remember that trade by definition involves more than one country and therefore more than one set of governing legislations. It's beyond, you know, England. This means that depending on who the trading partner is on the other end and what other jurisdictions a transaction passes through, we still may have some of those legacy paper-based hindrances holding back and holding back those benefits and the full impact. I guess what the UK has done is really set the stage as a leader when it comes to trade finance digitalisation, ensuring that we're in the best position to benefit rapidly once those digital network or digital network effects start to take hold. And I guess those other prominent trading nations will also begin to remove those digital barriers once they realise the benefits. There will be a lot more incentive for firms to then trade with other nations that have similar digital friendly rules in place, because obviously it means that it will ultimately mean that the transaction costs of trade will be smaller. I think that's a particularly important part. It's not just the time element of it, it's the fact that the cost of doing the transaction is much more, is much better for the counterparties. I guess in the medium term, once many other nations start implementing similar legislation and developing their capabilities, but before every nation does, I suspect that there will be an early mover advantage for the UK, and we'll see that they'll experience more trade at lower costs. I guess in the longer term, I think, you know, we might not have that first mover advantage of being one of the few viable, you know, digital friendly trading partners in the world, but we'll still have all the benefits of that digital trade that it will bring. Talking about some of the benefits, so increased efficiency, reduced cost, better data analytics, enhanced security, reduced risks, and better options and opportunities for further innovation. I guess looking at the trade finance sector, the fact that we can truly streamline and modernize the entire trade finance process, which, as you know, is extremely complicated, that's a good thing. So for example, transactions can become faster, we can do them more efficiently, they're less prone to human error. That obviously reduces the time and cost associated with the paperwork, the manual data entry, the physical document handling. Obviously that's going to benefit many of the businesses on this webinar today, the financial institutions involved in trade finance. I guess the digital trade legislation can also open up new avenues, new trading partners when it comes to trade financing. From a lending perspective, you know, we would like to think that a lot of the larger banks, as a result of those reduced costs and reduced risks, can lend to smaller, inherently more risky SMEs. So there's a big SME benefit for trade finance and working capital more widely. I guess the really important piece here is there will be more accessible data, so banks and other funders can base their credit decisions on SME applications on the state of their business, not just the lack of data. So I guess overall, really good for the UK, huge step forward, and hopefully it's going to be good at supporting UK traders. As I mentioned earlier, it's a permissive law, so it relies on everyone actually making use of this law and not just continuing the way they're doing. Thanks, Will.
Perfect. Thank you, Dipesh. Some really important points there. Really interesting to hear about the UK, taking a lead on this, but also I think some of the points you made about, making trade finance process a bit more streamlined and creating better access for SMEs is really important as well. And we'll come on to that point about other countries in a moment's time. But our next panelist, so Ramin, thank you for joining us as well today. Kevin and Dipesh have outlined the opportunities of the legislation, but as a technology provider in trade, what do you see as being potentially the challenges in making the potential of the Electronic Trade Documents Act a reality?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Will. Thanks to the Institute for inviting me to be on this panel. I think there are a lot of challenges. Before I get into the detail, I think it's worth mentioning just very quickly that we're not talking about just document archives. Most documents are instructions from one party to another, or they are declarations that other people rely on to make decisions. So actually, when we're talking about digital documents and digitalization, it's about the processes going digital, digital transformation, things like that, where you have to coordinate between your company, your suppliers, and your customers and your service providers. And then in the topic of the documents covered by the Act, it's these are documents that if you possess them, give you the right to receive goods and services, and it heightens that importance. So digital transformation is a lot of what we're talking about here, and for some people that can feel like just a sort of nice to have efficiency improvements for the business and the normal flow of trade. Oh, we can be a bit faster and save some pounds here and there. And while those efficiency savings can be very large for large businesses in their normal ops, they have such scale that it makes sense. But a lot of other companies, lots of SMEs don't see that value. So the other context to think about here when we look at international trade is what happens in a dispute between me and our company and our suppliers, or a regulator wants to come and audit us. Those sorts of contentious contexts. How can digital trade documents help us deal with those better? So for the companies that we kind of deal with, this sort of translates to helping improve their existing business processes to begin with. So it's not necessarily going to have immediately transformative, revolutionary impact on their business. Companies deal with document standardization issues. They've got information that's needed for different countries, but even within the country and within a market or different customers, for some reason people do things differently. So part of these digital transformation projects is to standardize things. If you can have more of your documents digital, it can help with that standardization. So there are benefits to be gained there. To have better auditability then as a kind of outcome of that. You have, as Kevin mentioned as well, things like fraud risk get reduced because there's more transparency, internal audit can be better, things like that. Just to pick one sort of segment, in pharma, they have a lot of different types of documents. So we've talked about bills of lading and documents needed for LCs, but also there are lots of licenses and permits and pharmacological reports and things, again, which Kevin mentioned, and Dipesh as well talked about some of these, that some of these may be outside of the scope of the Act, some of them are in, and so a question that remains for some people is, which ones are covered? And these gaps that we've had as businesses, large and small, that we try to have more of our processes to be done online, to be done digitally, to move away from paper. How much of that gap does this Act cover? So do we have enough coverage that actually we can start to move a lot of processes fully digital, not have to keep dropping back to paper and always keep a paper copy because we need it for such and such other purpose? So there's that kind of question that is there, and so adopting voluntarily to use the Act for a company would mean something like, using digital documents with their possession recorded on some kind of reliable system for their day-to-day ops, relying on them in case of disputes, especially if there are disputes with people who are not necessarily direct counterparties on a contract with us, which happens where there's some service provider dealing with moving the goods for our customer, and there's a dispute. This sort of regulation helps cover that kind of situation where you don't have a direct contractual relationship with other people. So there are lots of other challenges outstanding, of course. So a key one is, what is a reliable system? So the Act mentions a few characteristics, but they're very broad. And these are things that are being looked at by many people in the industry. For example, the Centre for Digital Trade and Innovation and the ICC, and people from the IOE are also involved. And this is a thing that is going to be looked at by the private sector to develop what works for the industry. There's the use case kind of support for different trade documents. So as I kind of said earlier, there are lots of different types of commercial invoice for different markets and different customers and so on. When these were paper, it was easy for someone, a human being, to pick up a document. Oh, it looks a bit different, but I know what it says. If you try to make that digital, you have to accommodate those slight variations and have that work. And there are now a lot more tools than there used to be to make that possible, but it's not a granted sort of outcome that, of course, every type of commercial invoice that you might throw at it will easily be digitalized, and we will be validly accepted and so on. And this kind of takes us into the next thing, which is, of course, interoperability. I think this was also mentioned earlier, that you need to have your systems work. So if you have to be the first mover, and you as a business have to pick a platform or a provider of a system for digital trade, and then it turns out a few months later that your main counterparts, customers and suppliers and so on, they pick a different one and they don't talk to each other, you're stuck in your silo, and you've wasted time. So that it's not a foregone conclusion at this stage that there will be lots of great interoperability. It's high on people's minds, so it's likely that that will be dealt with, but we don't know what that will look like right now. So that's going to be one of the things that sort of stops people adopting this very quickly. And then you have the standard things around more and more digitalization, data sharing. The users as well as business management need to know, if I click this button, who gets that information? If I use the system, who can see our highly sensitive information about our business? What about if there's a problem with the system? Is there liability cover for the system provider, for us as people who have to sort of take part in it? There are still legal questions as well, the types of documents that are covered, but also the governance of the law itself. Case law will develop to refine some of the information. And then cybersecurity risk, hacking will of course continue and become more prominent. People will still attempt to commit fraud as well, even if you have digital documents. People will inventively come up with ways that they think might work. So those things will carry on, and the systems that get developed need to prove themselves, not just being able to handle them, but handle them better than traditional paper trade, because that's what the sort of comparison is. So those are the types of risks that we see. People that we've been talking to recently, those are the sorts of things that they see as questions, right? Why should I take this on? And some of them will become clear over time, but some of them need a bit more proactive effort, possibly.
Terrific. Thanks, Rami. I mean, there's a lot of inbound answer. I mean, some of the things I take from it is a lot of it is about going to be giving businesses the confidence to start adopting these things, whether that's through standardization, interoperability, that word we have to get used to saying quite a lot, and kind of various things around security as well. So some really important points there. And obviously the onus is largely on the private sector, it seems. As you're saying, it's a very short piece of legislation at the moment. I think if you print it out, it's 4.5 pages long, which to many people might seem quite long, but for a piece of legislation, it's not that long. So some really important points. And it actually segues really nicely into our next panelist, Sylvia. It's always great to have an actual business representative on these panels. So could you say a little bit about what you're most looking forward to seeing as a business who's responding to these changes following the introduction of this legislation?
So hi everyone, thanks for having me. So we mainly look forward to simplifications on dealing with goods, especially under the letters of credit, as the bills of lading will be accepted in an electronic form. I think in general, it is a huge step forward, as Kevin mentioned earlier, towards the customs digitalisation, as the bill forms a legislative basis that could be built upon.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. And just, out of interest, obviously we've talked about the private sector and what support we can give to business, but what would you like to see from the government and stakeholders like the Institute to support businesses like yours to make the most of the opportunities of digitalisation?
So a couple points. So the clear guidance for the businesses as to how to apply the bill in practice. For the UK government to promote the bill amongst other jurisdictions that Dipesh mentioned, like for example within the Commonwealth, so the importers and exporters will share the mutual benefits. Also to add on the additional trade documentation, such as certificates of origin or UK EUR1s. To keep pushing towards the trade digitalisation, so continuing making the arrangements to accept electronic copies of the shipping paperwork, just in accordance to the ICC WTO Digital Standards Initiative mentioned earlier, as well as the Article 10.2 of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. Last but not least, to build on the bill and promote other initiatives, like, for example, the UK single trade window usage.
Terrific, thank you, Sylvia. We're getting some really positive comments coming through from the audience as well. A lovely comment from Jane saying, "Thank you, Ramin and other panelists. We've covered all my thought processes. It's such a great direction, but we need such a great initiative, but we need direction now on how we implement it without clashing down the supply chain." So that's very much mirroring what you were saying just now, Ramin, and thank you everyone on the panel so far. We're going to do a quick poll now, just to give you, the audience, another opportunity to have your say. And we'd like you to talk about what you see as being the most important opportunity in trade digitalisation, options being supply chain visibility and security. I'm doing this in reverse, I don't know why I'm doing that. But there's also carbon footprint, reduction of cost, speed and efficiency, and then other. And yet again, please do say what other might mean in the chat. Just for people answering that poll, Ilona, last but not least, thank you as well for joining us today. The panel has already covered an awful lot in the kind of initial discussion, but just wondering if you have anything you would like to add to what they've already said, possibly about how the legislation perhaps supports some of the other initiatives mentioned by Ilona just now, like the single trade window or the ecosystem of trust impact.
Thank you, Will. Indeed, the panel did cover a lot of information already. From my side, I would like to probably add that the Act itself is a very important piece of legislation. I would even call it a basis for a legal framework to enable the full utilization of both single trade window and the ecosystems of trusts, because it allows this full digitalization of documents, where we can already use some documents in the electronic form. I think people were still a bit discouraged by the fact that they cannot go through full digitalization of their supply chain, or that they could not take the full benefit of it. And with Electronic Trade Documents Act in place and legally binding, we'll have this word that we can start from the scratch if we are just starting our digitization processes in the company, big or small, or that we can actually go fully digital and take the full benefit of it.
Thank you. So it's really, this legislation very much providing that basis for digitalization. So thank you, Ilona. I'll close the poll now. Thank you everyone for responding. Once again, a few people have said, I wish I could have said all of them, but that's not the point of these questions. We want you to say what the most important opportunity is. And just about 2/3 of you, 65%, say speed and efficiency. and just under a quarter of you saying supply chain visibility and security. 7% reduction of cost. Interesting about kind of it's the speed point rather than the cost point, which is coming out more. And 5% carbon footprint. That's slowly growing every time, actually, even though it still remains quite low, but it's higher than it has been. So that's quite pleasing as well. So thank you everyone for responding to that. Just before I close the poll, does anyone from the panel want to say anything about that? And silence. I shall close the poll then, but yeah, thank you everyone for responding to that poll. Maybe it's not too surprising a response. Right, let's get into some of your questions. You are a brilliant audience who are already saying so many fantastic things in the chat. So the first question I will do, and it touches on a point you were mentioning earlier, Depeche, around kind of other countries. So we've had a question in from, where's it gone? So Jeff asks, how useful will new legislation be before widespread implementation of similar laws in other countries? And Marie also said the UK is taking a great lead with trade digitalisation, including through this legislation. But international trade involves more than one country. What are other countries doing in this space, and what can the UK do to drive international partners to introduce similar legislation?
Thanks, Will. I guess, yeah, the UK has been quite a torchbearer for digital trade, especially during its G7 presidency and now with the enactment of the ETDA. I guess international trade is always a complex dance involving many countries and other nations. Obviously, there are some nations, many nations are taking on the UNCITRAL, the MLETR, the Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records approach, rather than what the UK has done, which is create a bill around possessibility. So I guess I can give a bit of an overview or a kind of status check on some of the larger nations. So in the US, they've actually already put a framework in place to use most transferable documents electronically. There is still some fine-tuning needed, especially for documents like bills of lading. Germany, they're on the MLETR train. There's room for more utilization of their existing legislation, though. But in both of these examples, US and Germany, there's an opportunity for UK to offer, valuable guidance based on its own experiences for Germany to get the most out of MLETR. I guess Japan is one of the other G7 countries really diving into MLETR. So they have laws for electronic promissory notes and are keen on expanding their scope. France also poised to release the white paper. I think it was released very recently, actually, addressing the legal and business sides for MLETR. So they provide a great opportunity for the UK to partner on those research and initiatives to ensure the countries align on common standards. I guess there are many other countries that have been even more progressive outside of the G7. What comes to mind, Papua New Guinea, Belize, Kiribati, Bahrain, Paraguay, UAE, Abu Dhabi, general markets, that is, and Singapore. So they've already adopted MLETR. There's also India within the G20 framework. They're showing preliminary interest in MLETR. And China, with the help of Asian Development Bank, is also actively exploring MLETR. I would recommend the ICC Digital Standards Initiative, the ICDSI, has produced an MLETR or equivalent roadmap. So that's more of an interactive map, so you can see the status updates from all of those countries. It's also worth mentioning the big news coming out of the G20 Trade and Investment Ministerial meeting in India recently, and they identified 10 high-level principles for the digitalization of trade documents, and they're served as a guide for successful transition towards a more efficient and accessible global trade ecosystem, and to really drive coordinated legal reform across G20 nations in line with UNCITRAL's MLETR. So quite a few bits going on there, but hopefully that's an overview of what's going on globally, Will.
It definitely is, and it's some really interesting countries mentioned on MLETR as well. Papua New Guinea and Belize, incredible stuff, and but also a lot of G7 countries and leading UK trade partners as well, which is potentially significant. I mean, there's actually just a follow-up to that question. Obviously, the UK's signed a digital economic agreement with Singapore. Is currently in negotiations for potentially a deal with India. I mean, how important does the panel, and whether it's Depeche or maybe Kevin wants to come in, how important is the UK's trade deal negotiations in terms of trying to drive adoption of these kind of new digital initiatives?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and really, really important, I think, is the answer to that. And clearly the UK has done a lot of work on its trade agreements and is still doing that work. This gives the opportunity also to build on those trade agreements, to introduce digital trade more into those trade agreements. And I think also we need to reflect on even thinking about like lesser credit as we get closer in CPTPP, India, and other countries, that those trade instruments like documentary collections, use of bills of exchange and bills of lading and lesser credit are more prevalent. And it gives us the opportunity, I think, as the UK, if we're prepared to embrace those trade instruments, to actually trade more and be more trade successful. And if you can trade on letter of credit a first couple of times, then and successfully repeat business maybe on other terms of trade as you move forward. So I would generally say a big opportunity.
MLETR, ETDA and CPTPP. This job does not get easier, I have to say. Anywho, I'll do our next question. It comes from Terence. I think this would be a good one for Sylvia. So Terence makes the point that multiple trade IT systems have been introduced in recent years, whether that's GVMS or CDS. Many of these new systems have had teething issues. With trade being further digitalized, hopefully following acts like this one, should traders be prepared for further disruption before the benefits of these new systems come to fruition?
Always expect the unexpected. System downtimes and outages are inevitable. They must go through a sufficient number of upgrades in order to work effectively. So traders, yes, definitely should account for the IT disruptions, but I think at the same time, there should be a good communication between the traders, freight forwarders, the border agencies, the GVMS technical team, to know the extent of and the exact outage times. So, for example, the forwarders can plan the rerouting. And I think it's, yeah, all about the cooperation.
Cooperation and communication is always so key in trade anyway. Whatever happens with digitalization, that's always going to be important. Really good question from Agnes, and it comes from the point earlier actually about auditing. And this is another challenge potentially. So I wonder if I put this to Kevin initially. Agnes asks, do you think we have to re-audit our AEO accreditation as the electronic trade documents will cause changes in our documents, manuals and archiving? So I guess it's more broadly, it's a question about, will the change of how you do documents impact your auditing and keeping of records?
Yes, it's a good question. I guess a couple of aspects to it. One, I think it's important for any business exporting, importing, to obviously keep records, proof of export files, and so on. This is another example there as well. So if more documentation is more digital, then yes, obviously the processes need to accommodate that. The SOPs, the standard operating procedures, will need to accommodate that. So that's also one aspect of it. On the AEO side, I guess the way we trade, the trade compliance aspect, also bearing in mind some of the announcements in the border target operating model last week as well, is that it will need to accommodate different processes, different facilitations as we move forward as a nation. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the AEO would need to be reaccredited per se, but the processes definitely would need to be reviewed, the standard operating procedures reviewed, and anything provided digitally is available, but also backed up clearly as well.
Thank you, Kevin. I hope that's helpful, Agnes. Question from Frederick. This is a biggie. how do you see the legitimacy of decentralized infrastructure to mitigate the security risk, confidentiality, and legal risk you described? And I think that probably is best for Ramin initially.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think it comes down to adoption partly. So just like the Act itself, and there are some interesting developments in that area. There are things called decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials, which are proposed web standards, and they've been supported by the EU and Canada and US customs and things. So these are not fully developed things yet, but there's clearly interest from many people, but including governments and authorities in border control and so on. So that suggests there is definitely some scope there. I think that another point to note is in various places, but one recent example is in the Digital Economy Agreement between the UK and Singapore. Not only does it talk a lot about the model law on electronic transferable records and things, as it was signed before the Act came through, but it also mentions sort of open things for e-invoicing. It mentions one called PEPL. So again, these are sort of decentralized or federated ways of electronic, doing electronic invoicing in that case. So there's, there are, precedents for these sorts of things to be adopted at the high level and across the industry on a day-to-day basis. So watch this space. It remains to be seen where that will go, but there's definitely a case to be made.
Thank you, Ramin. And a question from, where's it gone? It's from Ben. I'll put this one to Ilona, and it's a broader question. I mean, it's a very broad question. How can businesses prepare for digitalized trade? Is it just a matter of using electronic versions of documents instead of paperwork, or would it involve a more significant impact on our businesses' trade processes? Should people be getting any training to make sure they're ready? Ilona.
I think it's a very important question, how people should get ready for that. It's for sure inevitable that people have to adopt new technologies and adapt also their knowledge and skills to trade effectively using those electronic trade documents. And it will be a learning curve for a lot of people, and also financial investment will be required. But we have to look at that from long-term perspective, and the saving benefits from like a long-term perspective. So I would suggest, we all probably suggest a holistic approach and holistic view on digitalization, and looking at redesign operational strategies, because digitalization and digital transformation is not about just trade. Trade is a part of our company, but actually we have to look at the company as a whole, depending on the size of the company. We should really look at those processes and do it with a proper plan in place, so that it's done from the beginning in a proper way, so that we avoid further additional costs and disruptions. So electronic papers play a big role, and they are an advantage, but we have to look at all the procedures within the company. And training and the management of change is a very, very big part of the whole digitalization process, bringing the electronic trade documents into the company as well. Because to achieve the success of the company, employees have to be up to date and be able to utilize this technology, and they have to believe in the technology as well, so that they feel comfortable using it.
Thank you, Ilona. A holistic approach is always definitely seems like a good approach when it comes to digital transformation. It feels as though you can't do that in silo. I'll do a couple more questions. I just want to pick up on something which was said earlier in the webinar around digital trade being a force for good. And I know kind of Dipesh, you mentioned as well, kind of closing the SME kind of trade finance gap as well. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and maybe both at a UK, but also at an international level, because I think it's a fascinating area.
Sure. Well, I guess historically, and particularly since the onset of the Basel banking reforms, banks, due to those capital requirements, can only lend a certain proportion of the deposits they kind of hold on their balance sheets, which means they've got to prioritize. They've got to prioritize who the best companies might be to lend to. Add to that the significant, it's incredibly important, but the significant KYC, AML, CTF checks on corporates and clients, also sanctions and complying with those, and the complexity of that. It just means doing trade finance or lending to smaller, inherently riskier, A and below companies is harder, because ultimately it costs a lot more, and there are figures between £10,000 and £30,000 just to onboard a business, and if a bank doesn't even make £10,000 to £30,000 profit of lending to those companies, they don't really see the point in doing that. So that essentially is why lending to smaller businesses is difficult, and it's got harder. It continues to get harder. Obviously, many banks tout that some of the main reasons for this are the operational costs and those hurdles to onboard those SMEs, in part due to lack of data. Obviously, a publicly listed large AA or A+ company is very easy to rate, and you have public ratings providers that provide that data and information. With SMEs, that's harder. The other piece is the sheer number of paper documents required, like the bill of lading. For every transaction that's happening, there'll probably be a courier or a plane couriering the documents over to match that transaction. So I guess this is a huge step in reducing some of those barriers, because you can now legally accept such documents in electronic form. I guess a similar narrative from a UK perspective is now our ability to share our banking details with third-party providers, so you can see all of your bank accounts, all of your balances, and we give permission electronically to allow those banks to send that information via open banking to a portal or a third party. And we don't need physical paper documents. We can open bank accounts online without physically signing documents. So this is that for trade, which is hopefully making it more open, more accessible. It's going to be really interesting in 1 or 2 years' time when we come back and see whether that's actually increased SME access to trade, and see whether banks are doing larger numbers of small volume transactions, which, yeah, we await and see.
We'll have to do another webinar in 2 or 3 years' time. That's what I'm getting from that. So thanks, Deepesh, for a great answer. Just one last question, because a few people have asked it, and I think it's one that Elena might be able to answer quite quickly. And it's, to what extent will the legislation affect other documents which aren't included in the legislation itself? So Fiona mentions kind of health documents for animal products. Kate mentions other HMRC documents. Kind of how quickly will this kind of indirectly impact other documents, I suppose?
So it's important to mention what the Act actually covers. It covers a document if this document is commonly used in at least one part of the United Kingdom in connection with trade or transport of goods, or if the possession of such document is required as a matter of law or a commercial custom. The Act itself, it has been written in this way. It's not very restrictive, so it doesn't block any other documents that already could be digitalized from additional burdens from new legislation. I believe that the Act itself is going to give this reassurance to government agencies and also to traders to uptake the digitalized documents, and it will speed up those processes. When it comes to HMRC forms, I strongly believe that coming back to single trade window, once this is in place, and we also have the trust in digital world, and single window will become this single source of truth and automation, and consist of those information, so we'll not have to input more than once. All those things will come all together as puzzles alongside UK border strategy, border operating model, the Act, and all the technology that has been developed in the process as well. Thank you.
That's so. Thank you, Elena. Watch this space, I think, is the big message there. But at this point, we're going to have to start wrapping up. So I would like to say thank you again to our fantastic panel today. So thank you to Dipesh, Elena, Ramin, Kevin, and Sylvia. But it was a really enlightening conversation, highlighting both the opportunities, but also, some of the things which will have to be overcome as this new landmark piece of legislation hopefully does have the impact which we all hope it will do. An additional thank you to Kevin as well for the presentation earlier, though we'll need to keep hold of you for just a little longer, if that's okay. Kevin, as we'll shortly be asking you to present a couple more slides, I just want to quickly do a final poll, just asking what people see as the biggest challenge that's posed by digitalisation. Very conscious of running over, but Kevin, just while we have you, is there anything you want to say to the audience as a kind of a final takeaway before we close the poll and go to
Yeah, so again, thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you to panelists. I thought I'd make a sort of shout out as well for the great work done by C4D2I, Centre for Digital Trade and Innovation. Nick Davies, not sure if you're on. I think it's been a real pleasure working with you. For Chris at the ICC and the great work done there as well. So, and I think by all working together, the whole industry working together, we can make digital trade across the piece work. And whether you're a shipping line, part of the shipping industry, banks, logistics service providers, government departments, and businesses, the importers, exporters, including SMEs, by all working together, we can make digital trade work. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Kevin. And just to share the result of the poll. So over a third of you say ensuring partners on board is the biggest challenge, interestingly. 29% of you, IT skills and implementation, and just over a quarter, data security. So thank you everyone for responding to that. But I just want to pass over to Kevin the next couple of slides just to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, so conscious of time, I won't be long. It's to say what we're very keen on is to link the digital trade to other initiatives, the ecosystem of trust work, and we talk about trade for good, the work we're doing in Africa as well, certainly amongst SMEs there is really important, and digital trade can help there as well. The future, again, the consultations, for example, simplification of declarations and utilisation of free trade agreements. So if we have the next slide, please. So also to point out the importance of training as well. So at a corporate level, the banks, the fintechs, the shipping lines, etc., learning about digital trade training so that everyone in your organisation, government departments, border force, for example, for e-bills, the sheer importance of understanding about digital trade documentation and digital identity. I'll pass back to you now, Will. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And I will say sorry everyone for slightly overrunning, but I hope you can see why we did. It's just been a very interesting conversation. But on the last slide, you'll see a reminder about the benefits of membership in our community, including regular updates on how UK Trade operates, access to our technical helpline, opportunities to network with peers, and much, much, much more. So go to export.org.uk for more information about all of these fantastic services. And here you'll also see information about our next webinar, which is an update on the CDS deadline for exporters. That's taking place on 26th September. A reminder, we will be sending the slides and recording of today's webinar in the follow-up email, which you should get in the next day or so. Please do get in touch if for any reason this email doesn't come through to your main inbox. But thank you everyone for joining us today. As you leave, please do let us know what you thought of today's webinar and any suggestions for topics in future events by completing the short exit survey. But for now, bye-bye.